Buckle up, folks. We're going back in time to 1793 Philadelphia.
Uh-oh, sounds rough.
It is. We're diving deep into the yellow fever epidemic. And we've got a great source for this one.
Ooh, let's hear it.
A history podcast episode. It goes beyond just the death and the disease.
Okay, so what else is there?
We'll see how it shook the brand new government, tested it to its core.
Makes sense. New nation, big crisis.
And exposed all these cracks in society, who could help, who couldn't, stuff like that.
Uh-huh, interesting.
Plus the medical debates, forget it.
Yeah, those are always a mess, even today.
Exactly, and a lot of what they were arguing about back then still has echoes today.
So much we can learn from how they handled things or didn't.
Okay, picture this. September 1793, Philly's the capital, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yellow fever is ripping through the city.
Bad news.
Total panic, people are running for their lives. Even big names, like Washington.
Oh, wow, even the president.
Even Washington. Thomas Jefferson, too? Gone.
That's Imagine trying to run the country from, hiding.
Exactly. And that's the thing. It practically shut down the government.
Communication must have been a nightmare.
Total nightmare. Leaders are all over the place. No one knows what's going on.
You got to make decisions, though. Somehow.
Right, but they couldn't even get good information.
So what did they do?
They were dipping letters in vinegar to try and kill the germs. Can you imagine?
Wow. Desperate times, huh?
So decisions got stalled. Washington stuck at Mount Vernon, just getting all these conflicting reports.
Frustrating.
Incredibly frustrating. He even said, the accounts we receive here are so opposite and unsatisfactory that we know not on which to rely.
You've got to feel for the guy, right?
Yeah.
Trying to lead a brand new nation during a plague.
Total chaos. But, there's this one guy, Joshua Dawson.
Here's that.
A clerk at the Treasury.
Okay.
His young daughter just died from the fever.
Oh.
But he still shows up to work every day.
Wow.
Determined to keep things running. He said, this ship is not going down on my watch.
Talk about dedication, my goodness.
Right.
That makes you think about the unsung heroes in any crisis.
Yeah.
Always people like that.
It really does. The ordinary people who just step up.
Yeah. Driven by duty, or maybe they just, need some sense of order when everything else is falling apart.
Yeah. It's a good reminder that individuals can make a difference, even when, the whole world's going crazy.
Absolutely.
But back to Washington, he had this whole constitutional dilemma on his hands.
Oh.
Congress is supposed to meet in Philly, in the Capitol.
Right.
But the Capitol's the epicenter of the outbreak.
Right. So what do you do?
He can't just move Congress without, maybe overstepping his power.
And remember, this new democracy, super sensitive to abuses of power, kings and queens manipulating parliament.
Exactly. So he's got to tread carefully.
What do you end up doing?
His attorney general, Edmund Randolph, advised him not to move Congress.
Interesting.
Said it would set a bad precedent.
Yeah, I see that.
So that was a huge moment, even though he didn't do anything,
Right. Set the stage for respecting the Constitution, even in emergencies.
Exactly. And that's how they've handled crises ever since.
Wow, fascinating how one event can shape things for centuries.
Absolutely. But while all that's happening with Washington, Philly's falling apart.
Even worse.
You've got red flags on houses to show their sickness inside.
Oh, like a warning.
Yeah, and the streets are dark, no one to light the lamps.
That's creepy.
And the death toll, it's just unbelievable.
I bet.
At the peak, over 100 people dying every single day.
Oh, my God.
Grave diggers were setting up tents in the cemeteries because they couldn't keep up.
That's a grim image.
Yeah.
And remember, this is before modern medicine.
Right, so what are the doctors doing?
Well, they were trying, but a lot of their theories, we know now, were completely wrong.
Probably made things worse in some cases.
Probably. And that brings us to Dr. Benjamin Rush.
Okay, he's a big name.
Huge. One of the most famous doctors in America. He was convinced that bloodletting and purging were the only way to treat yellow fever. Oh, like getting rid of the bad blood.
Exactly. But a lot of other doctors were like, whoa, hold on.
Not a great idea.
Not a great idea. Some thought it was downright dangerous.
Yikes.
And one of his biggest critics was Dr. Gene Deaves.
What did he think?
He thought they should just let the body heal itself. Let nature do its thing.
Interesting. Kind of the opposite approach.
Total opposite. Deaves was like, don't force your methods on nature. You'll just mess things up.
So you got this huge clash of medical philosophies right in the middle of this deadly epidemic.
Exactly. Imagine the pressure.
Must have been intense for everyone, especially for Rush.
It was. His own sister died of yellow fever, and he caught it twice himself.
Oh, wow. He really was in the thick of it.
He even wrote about being surrounded by ignorance and wickedness in the medical profession.
Sounds like he was pretty disillusioned.
Definitely fighting the disease, fighting his colleagues. It was a lot.
It's easy to forget that doctors are human too, you know?
Yeah.
All the stress and the grief, it takes a toll.
Absolutely. But while all this medical drama is playing out, there's another story happening too. The Black community in Philly.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
So many white people were running away, avoiding anyone who was sick.
Makes sense. They were terrified.
But Black Philadelphians, they stepped up. They volunteered to care for the sick, bury the dead.
That's incredible, especially considering the time period.
Right. It was a time of intense racial prejudice.
Huge risk for them to do that.
Huge risk. But the Free African Society, they played a key role in keeping the city going.
True heroes, stepping up when everyone else was stepping back.
Absolutely. And there's this one story, it's heartbreaking.
What happened?
This Black volunteer, he's trying to bury a man who died, with dignity and respect.
That's all you can ask for.
But the man's daughter, she freaks out.
Oh, no.
Terrified of getting sick, she wants nothing to do with him, just pushes him away.
Wow.
It just shows how prejudice mixed with the fear of the disease.
It's awful. But it makes sense in a way. People looking for someone to blame, someone to fear.
Exactly. And then you've got people like Matthew Carey,
Who was that?
a writer pretty well known at the time. He published this whole book blaming Black people for the epidemic.
Oh, come on. Spreading lies and hate during a crisis, that's low.
It was awful, but thankfully Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, leaders of the Free African Society, they fought back.
Good.
They wrote a pamphlet laying out all the good the Black community was doing.
Setting the record straight.
Exactly, highlighting their sacrifices, calling out the prejudice. That pamphlet was huge.
Yeah, primary sources like that are so important, especially for stories that get silenced or twisted over time.
So we've got individual acts of courage, but also organized efforts like Mayor Clarkson.
What did he do?
He had this committee running Bush Hill Hospital, taking care of orphans. They even went into debt trying to keep the city afloat.
They were really putting themselves on the line.
Yeah, it's the beginning of what we'd think of as public health, organized response to a crisis.
Fascinating to see that developing. You've got the everyday heroes, the organized efforts, and then the government trying to figure out what their role even is.
It's all connected, these different levels of response.
And it's all still relevant today, isn't it?
Mhm.
How we handle crises, the role of government, the stories we tell about who helps and who gets blamed.
It really is. It makes you think.
Yeah, and that's what we'll keep unpacking as we move into the next part of our deep dive, looking at how Philly started to recover, but also, how the scars of this epidemic stayed with them.
Okay, so we've seen the government basically fall apart, the city in chaos, doctors fighting over treatments.
Yeah, it's a lot.
But now we're getting to the aftermath. The yellow fever starts to fade, but it's not like everyone just goes back to normal.
Right. Recovery from something like that takes time. It's not a light switch.
So what happens? People start coming back to Philly. What do they see?
Well, it's a strange sight. Philadelphia's clean, like really clean.
How do you mean?
No more piles of garbage, dead animals, all that stuff that was just lying around before the fever hit. They had cleanup crews working nonstop.
Oh, wow. So the city is actually better in some ways.
In that way, yeah.
Yeah.
But there's this eerie feeling too.
Eerie how?
Like you run into your neighbor and you barely recognize them. Their face is gone. Their skin's got this yellow tinge from the disease.
Oh.
Some people's teeth are black from the mercury treatments. And, so many kids are gone.
Oh, right. The orphans.
Taken in by other families or, died from the fever. The podcast really highlighted that, just this feeling of absence, of loss.
Like a ghost town, but with people in it.
Exactly. And everyone's carrying this weight, this trauma.
So even when a crisis is over, it's not really over, is it?
No, the psychological and social effects, those can linger for years.
Yeah.
You don't just bounce back from something like that.
So people are trying to rebuild, but they're still scared.
Right. And then there's this moment at Bush Hill Hospital. They put up this big white flag that says, "No more sick persons here."
A sign of hope.
Yeah, but almost immediately, new cases pop up. They got to take the flag down.
Oh, no. So close.
It just shows how hard it was to get a handle on this thing. They didn't know how it spread, so even when they thought it was over, it wasn't.
And that uncertainty must have fueled the fear, right?
Absolutely. People were still dying, even if it was fewer every day.
So what was the message from the city leaders?
Stay vigilant. They kept telling people to whitewash their rooms, burn gunpowder to purify the air. All these things they thought would help.
It must have been so hard to balance that hope with caution, To move on without letting your guard down completely.
It was, and then Washington comes back.
Oh, right. He'd been away the whole time.
Weeks of isolation, finally gets to see what's left of the capital.
What did he think?
He was actually impressed. The streets were clean, people were going about their business, no obvious signs of fever.
So he decides to bring Congress back.
He does. Declares it safe enough.
It seems risky, don't you think? The epidemic wasn't completely gone.
Maybe. But remember, he needed to project strength, show that the government was back in control.
It was a political move as much as anything.
Probably. But whatever the reason, it was a turning point. The capital was back in Philly. Things were, at least officially, getting back to normal.
But there was a huge cost, wasn't there?
Huge. 5,000 people died in Philadelphia, 10% of the population. And for the survivors, the scars, both physical and emotional, they ran deep.
Yeah, and the podcast really highlighted Dr. Rush. He'd lost so much, his sister, friends, colleagues. He wrote about this ocean of grief he had to navigate.
It's a reminder that everyone involved, the doctors, the nurses, they weren't immune to the trauma. They had to cope with that too.
So the city's trying to heal, but the debates, they don't stop.
No, especially the big one, the origin of the fever. Was it homegrown or did it come from somewhere else?
Right, like imported from another country.
Exactly. And the College of Physicians, they were tasked with figuring it out. They sided with imported.
Oh, so Rush was wrong.
According to them, yeah. He was furious, felt like they were biased against him. He even resigned from the college.
So even as the epidemic fades, things are getting worse for him.
It's about to get a whole lot worse thanks to William Cobbett.
Who is that?
This English tribalist, sharp tongue, loved to stir up trouble. He published a newspaper called Porcupine's Gazette,
Okay.
and he went after Rush hard, called him a quack, a murderer, even questioned his sanity.
Oh, wow, full-on character assassination.
Yeah, and his insults were pretty creative. He compared Rush to all kinds of blood-sucking creatures, mosquitoes, leeches, weasels, you name it. Said they all understood bleeding better than Rush.
Savage. So what did Rush do?
He tried to escape the drama, applied for a job at Columbia University in New York.
A fresh start. Yeah.
Yeah, but Alexander Hamilton, he had a lot of pull at Columbia, and he blocked the appointment.
Oh, no, so he couldn't even get away from it.
It seemed like the shadow of yellow fever would follow him forever. You know, it makes you think, even back then, public opinion could be brutal.
Especially with newspapers, everyone reading the same attacks. Hard to change that narrative once it's out there.
And for Rush, this was devastating. His reputation was everything. He'd risked his life to fight this epidemic, and now he was being vilified.
It's like history repeating itself, isn't it? How information or misinformation can be used to attack people.
It's sad, but it reminds us to be critical thinkers, you know? Don't just believe everything you read.
So did Rush ever recover from this?
Well, John Adams, the new president, saw something in Rush, maybe his dedication, his talent, I don't know. He appointed him treasurer of the U.S. Mint.
A government position.
Yeah, not a medical role, but it offered stability. Maybe a chance to step back from the medical world, the controversies.
And did he find peace there?
It seems like he did. He never escaped the shadow of yellow fever, but he found a purpose in his new role. He contributed to the nation's development, maybe found some solace after everything he'd been through.
It makes you think. Even when you're knocked down, you can find a way to get back up, contribute in a different way. So what about the epidemic itself, the big picture?
It wasn't just about the death toll, right? This thing changed Philadelphia, changed the whole country.
We've seen the devastation, the debates, the slow road to recovery. But what about the long-term effects of this whole thing? Did any good come out of all that chaos?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The epidemic was like a wake-up call for the young U.S. government.
How so?
Well, remember how paralyzed they were at the beginning? Leaders scattered, communication breakdowns.
Yeah, it was a mess.
So Congress realized they needed a plan B. What if the capital cities hit with another crisis?
Makes sense.
They pass a law giving the president the power to call them to meet somewhere else, outside the capital, if there's an emergency.
That's smart, kind of like a backup plan.
Exactly. And Pennsylvania did the same thing for their governor. No more being stuck with no one in charge.
So they actually learned from the disaster.
They did. And those changes are still in place today. The way the U.S. government handles emergencies, part of that goes all the way back to 1793.
Wow, that's a big legacy for one epidemic. What about Philadelphia itself? Did they change anything?
Big time. They got serious about sanitation, implemented stricter codes, all that stuff.
Trying to prevent another outbreak, I guess.
Exactly. And get this, in 1800, they built the first major public water system in the country.
Wow, that's huge.
It was. Meant cleaner water, Fewer places for mosquitoes to breed?
Oh, right, because now we know mosquitoes carried yellow fever.
Yeah, but back then they had no idea. Still, those changes made a difference.
So even though they didn't know the cause, they figured out some ways to prevent it.
Exactly. It's amazing how a crisis can push people to innovate, find solutions they wouldn't have thought of otherwise.
But yellow fever didn't just go away, did it?
No, unfortunately not. It kept popping up, especially in the South, for decades.
So they were still in the dark about what caused it.
Pretty much. Until the early 1900s, when a doctor named Walter Reed finally proved the mosquito link. That was a game changer.
Yeah, finally understanding how it spreads.
It meant they could focus on mosquito control, things like draining swamps, using insecticides, and then in the 1930s, bam, they developed a vaccine.
So we went from bleeding people to basically wiping out yellow fever.
Yeah, it's incredible to think about how far medical science has come, all because people kept asking questions, kept searching for answers.
It's pretty inspiring. And what about Dr. Rush? We left him dealing with that whole Cobbett mess. Did he ever find peace?
Well, he sued Cobbett for libel, and he won.
So justice was served.
Kind of, but Cobbett skipped town before paying up. So more of a moral victory for Rush. He never really got his reputation back.
And his government job, the Mint. Did he at least find some purpose there?
It seems like he did. He might not have been a doctor anymore, but he was still contributing to the nation. Maybe that helped him heal, after all the trauma of the epidemic.
Yeah, finding a way to move forward, even if it's not the path you expected. So what's the big takeaway from all this?
I think it shows that even in the face of something horrible like an epidemic, people find ways to be resilient. They help each other, they rebuild, they learn from their mistakes.
It's kind of a hopeful message, isn't it, that we can overcome these things?
It is. But it's also a cautionary tale. Remember all that misinformation spreading during the epidemic?
Yeah, people blaming black people, attacking Dr. Rush. It's scary how quickly that stuff can take over.
It's a reminder that we need to be careful, be critical thinkers. Don't let fear and prejudice win, especially during a crisis.
It's a good lesson for today, too. It feels like we're always dealing with some kind of crisis.
We are. And the choices we make individually and as a society, they matter. Just like in 1793, those choices have consequences. What we learn from the past can help us build a better future.
So that's the challenge, right? To learn from history, be kind to each other, and work together to face whatever comes next. It's been a wild ride going back in time with you to 1793. Thanks for taking us on this journey.
Thanks for having me. I think we all learned something today.